The book of Judges ends with a very famous line. It's going to be up here on the screen. It's the very last thing in the whole book of Judges. And this is what it says. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Now, you don't have to read much of the Bible to know that when everyone is doing as they see fit, that's bad news. Nothing good is happening when everyone does as they see fit in their own eyes. The problem with this particular text isn't the assessment on the back end. The problem is the assessment on the front end. The belief locally in Israel is that the reason everyone is doing right in their own eyes is because there is no king. Now, that's not God's point of view. That's Israel's point of view. And it'll quickly become a point of contention in 1 Samuel, where we're going to look today as we begin to look at Samuel, the prophet's life. The people of Israel's assessment of the problem is that the rest of the nations around them have a king, and things seem to be going all right for them. But we, Israel, don't have a king, and we live in fear. Therefore, the problem must be that we don't have a king. Now, enter into that situation Eli. Eli is the priest over Israel. He serves as a judge, although he's not considered one of the judges of the book. He is leading the show, but Eli can't even get his own house in order. All of his sons are well out of line. In this world where Eli is leading the charge of Israel, there is a woman named Hannah. We talked about Hannah a few weeks ago when we had a guest preacher here. She could not have a child. She wanted a baby more than anything, but she was barren. And Hannah for us should represent in the story Israel. They have a same problem. Israel and Hannah are both barren. They feel empty. They want more. They yearn for more. But the problem diverts almost immediately in the directions that Israel and Hannah go. Hannah, barren, yearning for a child, turns to God and prays and begs that God would give her a child and promises that if she were to receive a baby in her belly, the baby would be given right back to God. Israel, the nation, in their barrenness, in their loneliness, in their brokenness, in their fear, they do not turn to God. They keep turning to the world and surveying the landscape. And as they survey the landscape, they think they've got a raw deal. And so they gripe to God. They complain to God. They demand from God that they get a king. Hannah's prayer is answered. Israel's prayer is answered. Hannah's answer to prayer goes a lot better than Israel's answer to prayer. Hannah gets a son, and sure enough, she gives this son right back to God. The son's name is Samuel. And immediately, she brings him to the temple and allows him to start hanging out with the temple. Eli, who has so many problems with his own sons, decides to take Samuel in his own. He can tell that something is going on in the life of Samuel, and he wants to mold him and mentor him and help him. And so he does just that, and Samuel begins to grow up in the ministry alongside of Eli. And so one night, Samuel starts hearing a voice, and he assumes that this is his mentor, Eli, calling him. So I don't know why I do this, but when I read this text, I kind of imagine Samuel in about third grade, maybe 8 years old. For those of you who have children or have had children, maybe having your child wake you up in the middle of the night isn't the best time to have a reasonable conversation with them. And that's exactly the problem that Eli has. I can so identify with him. Samuel comes in and says, "Eli, I heard you call me. I'm here." And Eli says, "Wasn't me. Go back to bed." At least that's how I would say it. I'm not very happy in the middle of the night. So Samuel goes back to bed. He hears Eli's voice again, or what he thinks is Eli's voice. He comes, "Eli, I'm here. What is it you want?" And Eli says, "Go back to bed, Samuel." And he comes a third time and says, "Eli, I hear my voice being called." And at this point, Eli recognizes it's not him, it's no one else. It must be God calling to him. I don't know if you have this problem that Samuel has. I have this problem too. God is pretty clear in the middle of the night. I often, when God wants to speak to me in the middle of the night, I say, like, can you wait until the drive tomorrow morning after I've had my coffee? Like, I'll turn the radio off for you. It's cool. But Samuel, in his little boy state, hears the voice of God in the middle of the night. And Eli says, that is the voice of God speaking to you. Next time you hear it, say, here am I, Lord. What is it that you want with me? And so once again, the voice comes to Samuel. And Samuel says what Eli told him to. Here am I, Lord. What is it that you want? And he begins with great news, exciting news. He says, oh, Samuel, you just wait at what I'm going to do. It is something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. Well, that's exciting. Well, that's going to be great. What's that going to be? I mean, even imagine in your childhood state how excited you'd be if you knew that God was saying he was going to do something so big that the ears of everyone would tingle. Unfortunately, God's not done with what he has to say to Samuel. Samuel, again, as a little boy, gets this word from God. Tell Eli that I've spoken against his family. I'm going to judge his family, and the guilt of his house will not be atoned for. Oh. Okay. So the next morning, everyone wakes up, and Eli's excited. He remembers the encounter they had at night, and he goes and finds Samuel, little boy, and he says, what did God say to you? And Samuel says, well, he says, God's going to do something so big that the ears of all of Israel will tingle. That's great. Can you just imagine how excited Eli is? Anything else? Did he say anything else? What else did God say? And Samuel, again, a little boy, says to his mentor, yeah, there was one more thing. Oh, yeah, okay, what was it? God says he's going to judge your house and all your sons for the sins of your sons, and that there is no way you can find forgiveness for what you've done. Ouch! Ouch! And Eli, who is a noble man and a good man, receives it with such charity. If this is the word of the Lord, may it be so. May it be so. And so the next few chapters are a wild sort of back and forth of Samuel moving to prominence and Eli passing and the Ark of the Covenant. I mean, you've probably seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? That thing that God's presence was in when the slave Israelites left Egypt. They carried the ark, and they believed the very presence of Yahweh was in it. That ark is still around, and it keeps bouncing in and out of possession of the Israelites. And every time it's captured by the Philistines, the Israelites have this panic attack that God is no longer present with them and no longer on their side. And so they're in constant battles trying to grab the ark back and bring it back to themselves so that they have the presence of God in their camp. And this only escalates that problem that Judges ends with. This concern, this belief that they need a king to bring them leadership. The nation that keeps taking their ark, the nations that keep picking on them from around, they all have kings. Israel does not have a king. And so this whole story comes to a head when the priests and the elders of Israel gather to Samuel in a big meeting, and it happens in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. We're going to read that text together today. If you have your Bibles, I invite you to follow along. If not, the words will be on the screen, and you could follow over my shoulder. But would you join me in standing as we read the word of the Lord? Chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old." Thanks. "And your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when But when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us,' this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, 'Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do.' Samuel told all of the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, 'This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your men servants and your maid servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day.' But the people refused to listen to Samuel. 'No,' they said, 'we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles.' When Samuel heard all that the people had said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, 'Listen to them and give them a king.' Then Samuel said to the men of Israel, 'Everyone go back to his town.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. This speech that Samuel gives is the harshest critique of the monarchy in the entire Old Testament. There's debate among scholars as to whether or not it was written initially with 1 Samuel before the kingship started, or if it was written during the time of Solomon as a direct critique of what Solomon had become as king. Because these things did not last but till the third king before it all came to be true. The third king brought this prophecy to full light. And the prophecy, the word that Samuel has of warning for the people of Israel, is dominated by one word. What is that one word he uses over and over and over? Take. A king takes, and God gives. A king takes, and God gives. This word is used 6 times. Take. It is there for emphasis. You can ask for a king all you want, but he will take you, and you will beg for relief from what this king does, and God will not listen. That's a terrifying word. Terrifying. The prophecy is terrifying, but the people yearn so deeply to be just like the people of this world that they would rather roll the dice living the way the world lives rather than living the way that God has called them to live. God is a God who gives. He gives land. He gives life and freedom from slavery. He gives crops. He gives rain. He gives and he gives and he gives to Israel, and it's never enough. The longing and desiring of the people of Israel's heart is finally to be just like everyone else. They want nothing more than to fit in. And so, they would rather spend their money creating an oppressive monarchy than living into the covenant that God has called them to. Covenant is much different than contract. Kings are people of contract. They take, and then they give you something little in return. A covenant is when two parties come together and bond together. They both offer something to the other. God asks of his people simply praise and fidelity and worship, and he will give them life and water and crops and land. God gives, kings take. Yet, Israel chooses the bad option in spite of Samuel's plea and warning. Many of us, I think, can imagine ourselves in the shoes of Israel, stepping into something that's a bad deal for us because it helps us fit in, losing our fidelity to God because we want to be comfortable and look like the rest of the world. Israel makes our mistake. And so Samuel now, having had this confrontation with the powerful people of Israel, is now in the business of looking for a king. And the king he finds is a man named Saul. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the smallest tribe in all of Israel. You wouldn't imagine you would find a king in that tribe, kind of backwater, across the bridge, kind of like Appalachian, Kentucky kind of place, you know. He goes there and he walks up to Saul and he thinks that Saul might just be the right king for Israel. These are his qualifications according to the Bible, true story. 2 qualifications that make Saul qualified to be king. One is he is handsome. I'm serious. He's handsome and he is tall. Those are his qualifications to be king. He's handsome and he's tall. That's like us voting for Shaquille O'Neal to be our president. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. And yet, this is exactly the kind of king that Israel wants. Physically imposing, a man's man. The kind of person you want to be like, right? Kind of James Bond-y, right? And so that's what they do. They grab Saul and they make him king. Samuel puts oil on his head and anoints him king, and Saul rises to the kingship. He looks like a king. Strong and powerful and tall and good looking. And Israel got exactly what they wanted. You see, Saul didn't last very long into his kingship. In fact, the very first story we get of him as king is him already failing. You see, kings, what they do in this time is they keep the Philistines at bay. That's their job. Keep the Philistines at bay and out of Israel. And so Saul is a little nervous about this gig, right? He sees the Philistines, they've got an army, they've got all sorts of powerful warriors, they've got the best equipment in the world, and Saul's a little nervous. He's kind of shaking in his boots a little scared. And so you know that a leader who is scared hands that fear down to his ranks. And so the army gets afraid, and the Israelite army starts spreading and hiding and going away until Saul has barely anything left and the Philistines are coming. And they look ill-prepared, his army, and they look half there, and Saul realizes he is in trouble. And so what he does is he sets up a burnt offering to God. And he goes and he lights an offering to God. And Samuel hears about this and he says, no. This is not your job. I'm the priest of Israel. You are the king. Your job is to keep the army intact, not have them all run home like scared babies. If you want God's help, you should have started there and not waited until you made the whole army afraid. And so he says to Saul, that's it, you're done. God's anointing on your life as king is gone. And so Samuel is off looking for another king. Saul keeps functioning in the role 30-some years, but he is completely ineffective. So Samuel is not going to make the same mistake he did with Saul. He prays to God about who the next king would be. And God says to him, I want a man who's after my own heart. And so Samuel agrees, and he begins to figure out who this person would be. And he gets led to the tribe of Judah. And as he moves through the tribe of Judah, he runs into a man named Jesse. And he says, Jesse, do you have any sons? Jesse says, I have great sons. He says, well, I think that God is calling one of them to be king. And Jesse says, that sounds right. I have great sons. And so he goes and he grabs his sons and he lines them all up. And Samuel goes and stands before each of the sons and prays to God. And he gets to the end of the line. He's gone through all of the oldest, and he's kind of at the the high schooler ones. And he's praying, and he turns to Jesse and he says, I thought you said you had great sons. None of these are the king of Israel. Is this it? Is this all you have? And Jesse says, well, we got the runt of the litter. He's out in the field protecting our sheep. You don't want him. And Samuel says, look, bring me to him. I've got to see if this is who God wants. And so he goes out into the fields and finds this little shepherd boy, ungrown, unkempt. His whole role in life is keeping lions and wildlife away from the family sheep. And Samuel steps up to him, and this is exactly who God wants. The antithesis of Saul. Saul is big and proud and mean. He looks like all the other kings of the rest of the world. David looks like he could use a shower. Right? These are two very different people. And yet Samuel takes oil and pours it over little David's head and says, you are now anointed to be king. Saul doesn't like that there's another anointed king in Israel. So the rest of them spend the rest of 1 Samuel kind of running from each other, and David keeps having the chance to kill Saul, and he keeps avoiding killing Saul. And Saul is in danger. He's completely inept. He's exactly what Israel asked for. They got what they prayed for. David, however, in many ways is one of the very few good kings that Israel ever had. He was a man after God's own heart. He brought to Israel the justice and worship and centrality of God that God yearned from the people. David made his mistakes. For any of you who've read any of his stories, you know he made some huge errors, but he led Israel well. He did okay. But his son Solomon ruined the kingdom, split it in two, and the kings that came one after another were evil and vindictive and poor. Israel prayed to be just like all the other nations, and they got exactly that. This was never what Israel was supposed to be. God didn't reach into the slavery in Egypt of these people who were groaning to him and lead them out into freedom so that they could be a nation just like all the other nations. That's not what God had in mind. In fact, God had in mind the exact opposite, that his people would be a city on a hill, a shining light of God's goodness for the sake of the world, that all of the world would come to worship God because they would see the way that God cares for and interacts with these people, that the people didn't need a king, that they worshiped God and followed him, and that God's leading was enough, and it led to prosperity and goodness. And the world would see that in Israel's differentness, that this God was worth following. But it wasn't enough for Israel. Israel looked around the rest of the world, and the tangible that they could see was more seductive than the loving God that they couldn't see. And so the very desire of Israel's heart shifted to want to be just like everyone else. I suspect that we make the same mistake. We worship a God we can't see. God's blessings come and they go, and the more that they go than they come, the more we begin to take our own life into our own hands. We assume that we want what everyone else wants, and what everyone else has quickly becomes the priority of our own life. The idea of being a city on a hill for the sake of the world has been a metaphor that has really diminished amongst us in the church. We want to get as much world as we could possibly get our hands on without losing our last little grasp on God. Imagine for a moment that an alien came to Earth and landed in Ellicott City, Maryland, knew nothing about the world, the earth, knew nothing about how our civilization was, knew nothing about our priorities, knew nothing about our governments or our nations, knew nothing about our culture, our politics, our social media, our schedules, knew nothing at all about the way that our world works. They've landed in Ellicott City, and they found you. They've gotten a hold of your cell phone, your schedule, your bank account, your social media page. They've read through everything about you. Who do they assume your God is? They've seen your bank account, your schedule, your social media, your calendar. What do they go back to their planet and say about your God? Who do you believe will be your salvation? Is it you? Is it your money? Is it your president? Is it your kids' games and their future scholarships? Is it the cash that you have? Or the buying and spending power that you've accumulated? What is your salvation? Lesslie Newbigin was a missionary to India in the 20th century who came face to face with this question in a way he never anticipated. He grew up in England, was a member of the Church of England, and was commissioned and sent to India as a missionary. He spent his entire adult life, almost all of the 20th century, in India, having come from Great Britain. He left a culture that was centered around the church and a church that he felt worshiped God well, and he went to India in a completely non-Christian place. He was by far the minority, and he began to proclaim missionally the gospel to the people of India. He told them about how good God was, and he saw people's lives changed, and the church, little as it was, catch on fire in India for the mission of God. It was uncomfortable to be Christian in India, and the church, small as it was thriving. And his day came that he retired. He was aged and old, and so he went back to his home in Britain and was so excited to be back in places that were comfortable. And he began to participate in his retirement in the church again. And he found this sort of post-Christian culture that we know of in Europe now, this laissez-faire religion, this cold check off a box, got to get to church and do my part and then get on with life religion that's plaguing Europe now. And Lesslie Newbigin was dumbfounded by the lack of passion that he saw there. It was so easy to be Christian in the West, and yet no one was. In fact, it had church attendance even dwindled under 20%, and the people who went were like the frozen chosen rather than the on-fire people of God. How was it he could see such expressions of God's activity in a pagan place like India and find a people indifferent in his homeland of Great Britain? Jesus lived in an Israel that should have known better. It was the product of that yearning for a king. Israel spiraled out of control, went off to exile, came back, built a second temple, and eventually Greek and Romans came in and took over. Everyone in Israel believed that they were a Jew and went through the motions of being a Jew, and they believed that in spite of their oppression and foreign governments, they believed that they were God's chosen. But yet they couldn't identify Jesus or anything of what he was talking about. And he talked a lot about being different in a world that oppresses us. You see, the religious people of the day would try to trap Jesus all the time. One of my favorite times that he did that is they said, tell us what the most important commandment from the law is. What is the most important command? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is nearly as important, love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the commandments is summed up in these two things. Well, Jesus answered that question well, but it was when he explained what a neighbor was that he really scandalized the people who were the elite religious types of the day. You see, he told a story about the neighbor as the Good Samaritan. We all know the Good Samaritan, and so many of us put the emphasis on the Samaritan themselves. How good is that Samaritan, right? We have laws that give grace and a break to people who will stop with their life and help someone. But the point of that story was never the Good Samaritan. The point of that story is he was talking to religious people of his day, and he pointed out that the Levite and the priest, the holy people of Israel, walked right by. They knew the law to love God and love neighbor, and yet their schedules and appointments were more important than helping someone in need. They did not reflect the glory and love of God to a people in need. But even a no-good, pagan, backward, half-breed sinner like a Samaritan could follow the law and the call of God. This scandalized the people. There's a story recently of an Amish man. We love interviewing Amish people. They are so weird compared to us that we're fascinated by them, right? How is it in this world, 2018, do you not live with electricity? How do you even do that? If my phone gets below 50%, I start getting nervous. How do you do that, right? So we get interviews and stories from Amish people all the time. And, we want to know how they live that way. We want to know how they cook those noodles. Where does this food come from? So it's so good, right? Well, a man went out to interview the Amish, and they were doing a TV story on it. And so one of the questions that he asked, which is a pretty common question that people have with the Amish, is, so are you a Christian? Is this what compels you to live this way? Are you a Christian? And the response of the Amish man is so powerful and important. I want you to lean into this answer. He said, am I Christian? Yeah, I don't suppose that you should be asking me that question. He pointed to his neighbor's house, and he says, why don't you go and ask them if I'm a Christian? They'll give you a better answer than I can. Our neighbor may have a better sense of whether or not we're living up to the call in our lives to be the people of God than we do on our own. So often we are so good at claiming Jesus, but then also trusting our politics. We're so good at claiming Jesus, but really finally trusting our bank account. We're so good at claiming Jesus and giving Jesus our Sunday mornings if we can make it, but then believing that it's our jobs or our kids' futures that'll save us. The question really should be, what do we really believe is our salvation? What are we being saved from? What are we being saved to? What does our life testify to as to what we believe God is? When we lay down all of the theatrics, when we lay down all of the masks, when we lay down all of the stories, when we lay down all the things we assume about ourselves, what is our life testifying to? Samuel, the book of Samuel, got to the bottom of the story. The people of God wanted to be like the world more than they wanted to be like God. That's a problem I suspect we're still facing today. Our social media accounts, our interactions with neighbors, our sense of mission in our own life has become so docile and worldly. Sometimes I wonder if we even smell a little like Jesus. We trust in what the world has to offer because just like Israel, we want a king of this world that we can look at. Doesn't matter what he takes from us. We want to fit in when God is calling us out. Strikes me as interesting, the New Testament word for church. Israel is Israel. God does something new in Jesus and the church forms, right? The word church is ekklesia, Greek word. Sorry for the Greek lesson. Ekklesia. All that word means is the called out ones. If we're going to be the church, we can't go to a place. We have to be called out of the common everyday American life that we have trusted as our salvation. We've got to be called out of that back into being the people of God, where God is central to how we make our schedule. God is central to how we spend our finances, where we have a sense that God has given us a job and a family, not for us to partake of or to take from, but as resources to be a part of God's heartbeat for the salvation of his world. What if all of the gifts that God has given us are not burdens, but they're strategic placements in our life that we could sense our role again as missionary for the sake of the world? That we no longer live just like everyone else with a common everyday lifestyle like everyone around us does. That's not the point. The point is to be called out from that, to be caught on fire for God, to live as if he is king and reorient our schedule around God. That when people see us, we don't have to tell them that we are Christian, but our life has already told them. The band's going to come out and we're going to sing a final song of praise. And if you're wondering today, if you're feeling the sense within you well up that maybe you're living a half Christian life, or maybe you're not fully devoted to him, maybe you've not submitted everything to God, maybe you're trying to get just the little slightest bit of Jesus that you can possibly get so that you don't go to hell eternally and you live in heaven instead, but not fully devoted, circling your life around God. Don't let the moment pass. Come forward and kneel at the altar and pray that God would fill you with his Spirit. Pray that God would remove you and rebend you, that your desires would look like his desires, that your yearnings would look like his yearnings, that your personality, your disposition, everything you want becomes aligned with what God is trying to do in our world today. There is beautiful, beautiful adventure and joy and hope, purpose, meaning on the other side of commitment to God. You see, the common everyday life that we think we want to fit into takes from us. But the God whose life we submit ourselves to, God gives. It seems strange from the way we've imagined the way the world works. Submit to yourself to him and see what gifts he'll give you on the other side. Would you stand as we sing? Please come forward and pray if God is calling you.